Mediterranean Fire. I am your host, Biba Chic, and this is our co-host, Ed Gardner. How's it going?
Good, Biba. Thanks for having me on. Thanks for inviting me to be your co-host.
Yes, I'm looking forward to opening up some stories that you have about all your work with the artists of Detroit, and also all the film, what do you call them? Like, I wouldn't say movement, but that film that kind of changed Detroit, that went on for quite a long time. In Zero?
In Zero, yes.
Yeah. Does everyone know In Zero? Well, this is the director, Ed Gardner.
Actually, producer, not director.
Yes, you were on the team, though. You were also a writer, right?
Yeah, writer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, could you tell us what was like? How did this? How did this start? Like, what was like the main like idea that all this film sprang from?
Well, it was I had a friend who was he was a filmmaker, and he had done a little short, and he had a script for a feature film.
Mm-hmm.
And he asked me, he knew that I had produced events in California for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And he asked me if I would produce the film he wanted to make.
Mm-hmm.
And so we started this indie film. It was about a young artist in the underground scene in Detroit. And we did it like a Run Lola Run kind of concept, where, you know, the main character walks into a nightclub, he meets a girl, and then a whole bunch of stuff unfolds.
Mm-hmm.
And then we cut to right before he walks in the nightclub, and he walks in the nightclub and meets a different girl.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea was there's a different future possible from a different set of circumstances, and it's all happenstance, right? And so there were like 5 different unfoldings, and eventually he becomes an artist.
Uh-huh.
So we made that, and it took us. We only shot on weekends, and it was a no-budget movie. Everybody involved was working for free,
Mm-hmm.
and we had a small crew, and one camera, and it was right when digital cameras were first becoming available, and we had a $3,500 camera, which at the time was like amazing
Mm-hmm.
and cutting edge, and hundreds of thousands of dollars less than what we would have had to have used if we were using film.
Mm-hmm.
And so we did this whole project, and we gathered this team of people, and we finished it, and we kind of looked at each other, and everybody was going their own way.
Mm-hmm.
It was like the project was over, and everybody was going their own way, and it was just him and I editing. Everybody else was done.
Uh-huh.
And we're looking at each other, it's like, well, that was fun, but now we don't have a team anymore, and everybody. And so, what can we do to have more fun, basically?
Mm-hmm.
How do we create a bigger and longer lasting
Mm-hmm.
playground?
Mm-hmm. Oh.
And this was, this was instigated by this sense of there's something missing in Detroit. There's not a community.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I was in Hollywood for a long time, and although I wasn't in the film industry, I was in a catering industry, so I was on movie sets and at
Mm-hmm.
movie industry events
Mm-hmm.
every day.
Mm-hmm.
And what was striking for me coming from Hollywood and coming to Detroit was in Hollywood, everybody knows everybody.
Okay.
And it's a huge community,
Mm-hmm.
with a lot of millionaires,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, but everybody knows everybody. Everybody goes to the same parties and the same industry event, the Oscars, the Emmys, the
Mm-hmm.
Golden Globes. Everybody knows everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And what I was seeing here was that there were all these little pockets of filmmakers, like 4 or 5 guys in their basement making short films together. I mean, even Sam Raimi came out of that kind of environment,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, it was him and his high school buddies making Evil
Yeah.
Dead.
Yeah.
And so what we realized was, if we could design a project that was longer
Uh-huh.
and that we could include everybody in,
Mm-hmm.
we could create a community.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was our actual agenda. It wasn't so much to make a
Absolutely.
TV show, it
Uh-huh.
was to create a community. And
Mhm.
that was what drove the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And in doing that, we created an environment where our our show succeeded. We were able to screen it and sell DVDs and do that because we created a community first.
You know what? It reminds me of in Beirut, Lebanon, you know, that place that was like, it was supposed to be the most devastating civil war in the history of the planet, and you were like totally amazed at how in this, you know, I don't know, fiery nightmare of bombs and slaughter, that the newspapers, some of them, the newspapers would function every single day, you know, no matter what was happening. They would, you know, they'd be sleeping on the floors of their office with no electricity. Whatever happened, they'd be trembling in the corners, you know, with their own lives at stake, with, you know, rubble falling down over them. But at any price, they wanted that newspaper to come out every day. And in the book of Robert Fisk, who was working with the Associated Press, who is one of my favorite journalists, he also, you know, covered the war in Ireland, and then he was living in Lebanon for 10 years, and he worked for the Independent, and his book Pity the Nation, you know, is a huge masterpiece, really. And he kind of was talking about something like you were just describing now with In Zero, and that is that before being a newspaper and an office in Beirut, they were first a community and of friends above all. So that's why that was the key, the underlying key for them to really be able to function that way, even in a civil war, you know, and to have that newspaper coming out every day.
And I think, you know, I think that's true in a lot of instances with media and with creative people. It's just, you know, people depend on the news. They need to know.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, for us,
Yes.
I mean, we were making fictional stuff, but we were including everybody we could include. I mean, if we had extras, they were all local artists and musicians.
Mm-hmm.
It was like looking at Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album cover. It was like, oh, who's that? Who's that? I mean, you can go through and look at every episode, and there's crowd scenes where you'll see recognizable Detroit people in them.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, and we went out of our way to invite people. We invited people at radio stations. I mean, at one point we were talking to Kwame Kilpatrick about being part of the show.
Mm-hmm.
And he was interested.
Mm-hmm.
We just couldn't make the schedule work, you know. But we reached out to everybody, and it gave us, it wasn't just that we were promoting them, but it was like everybody was in this venture together. And, you know.
How long did the whole thing last?
Over a year. We did 12 episodes, one episode a month.
One episode.
And we worked on a timeline. We knew that, you know, from the time the script was written to the time we were screening it, we had a timeline for every week. We knew every step of what had to happen. And because we did 12 episodes, there was overlap. Every episode was like 1 month off on the timeline. So by the time we were 3 episodes in, we were managing like 7 or 8 episodes simultaneously.
Oh, okay.
And you know, we would have a meeting every Monday that was just for department heads and their right-hand person. And there were 60 people in that meeting every Monday. And we would go over the timeline, and you know, but beyond that, because we had this commitment to everybody in the project, we would we'd try to get people gigs. We'd get them publicity. You know, we'd get write-ups for like our makeup guy. We got a whole write-up for him. We did Comic-Con in Detroit, and we took our makeup guy with us and set up a whole thing in our booth where he was doing alien faces all day long. And you know, and we were shooting him doing that, and people were, you know, walk up to our booth and interact with him.
Yeah,
and,
that's really nice.
you know, so it was like we tried to get the whole crew involved beyond just the making of the show, where, you know, they got recognition out of it. They got promoted. They, you know, we had 2 people on this crew who were like 16-year-old kids, a girl and a guy. And they became like superstars in their high schools.
Okay.
Because they got written up in the free press and in the news, and you know, it was like, and both of them are filmmakers now.
Now, could you go over the carriers in the film? Like, talk about the aliens and the carriers and the priests and
Well,
all that.
we created a whole world, and
How did you create this whole world? I'm saying you would like all be like kind of like in this community, and you'd all be like laughing and just like coming up with ideas and.
yeah, and it was inspired by Detroit, because we were making this in 05, 06, which was before Detroit came back, before the bankruptcy, and that was a time period when you could literally, like, if you wanted to shoot in an environment that looked like there were no people left, all you had to do was go downtown on a Sunday morning. There was nobody around. The streets were empty. I mean, we had many situations where we're shooting in the middle of the street, and you know, we didn't have permits. We never got permits for anything, and it was okay. As a matter of fact, at that time, that was before all the Hollywood movies came, before we had our tax incentives here in Michigan, and I remember two episodes that really impressed me. One, we were shooting a scene where we had a whole bunch of people having a gunfight in the middle of the street. And it was, you know, it was a neighborhood that was kind of abandoned factories and things, so it wasn't a lot of traffic. But it was like Sunday morning, we're shooting this whole thing. We got like maybe 30 actors, and they all got, you know, fake guns. And this police car pulls up and parks right in the middle of us. And these two officers get out and they go, "Hey, how you guys doing?" And we're like, "We're good." And we had trained our actors that if police came, put your guns down and step away from them. You know, and they did, and you know, and the cops kind of just looked around, walked around, and said, "Okay, well, be careful out here." Got back in their cars and drove away. They didn't ask us if we had a permit. They didn't, you know, tell us anything except be careful.
It was a playground.
Right. And it was funny because about a month later, I had a meeting with the director of the Detroit Film Office, Al Fields. And it was the first time I'd met him, and this meeting was set up by the mayor. He asked Brad Dick, the assistant mayor, to set up a meeting so that I could sit down with Al and we could talk about filmmaking in Detroit and how to create a film district in Detroit. And so I'm sitting down with Al for the first time, and he says, "By the way, I understand you guys were shooting scenes with guns the other day." And I didn't know where he was going with this, and I didn't know what to say, as I was kind of like, "Well, where'd you hear that?" He says, "Oh, the police." I said, "Oh," and before I could say anything else, he said, "You know, next time just let me know so that I don't look bad when they call me."
Oh yeah, okay.
And that summed up our relationship with the city. It was like, you know, one time they actually called me, and you know, we used to shoot on the People Mover. And to shoot on the People Mover, you have to have insurance, and you have to, you know, reserve it with the film office. And they send somebody from the film office to be with you and chaperone you and make sure you don't have any problems, and you know, that you don't get trapped or mugged or whatever, you know. So we're shooting pretty much every month. Every episode we had some scenes, because in our future there were no cars. There were only the People Mover and walking around. It was a dystopian future.
I love that word, dystopian. I want to talk about it in a second. Wait a second.
Okay.
You are watching Mediterranean Fire. I am your host, Biba Sheik, with co-host Ed Gardner. Thank you so much for co-hosting. Streaming live on WJZZ on Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter, and other top social media platforms. So like, share, follow, and subscribe.
All right. Well, so the thing about that was we were shooting almost every month, and one month we weren't. And I got a phone call from the film office, and you know, the person that I usually dealt with there, Erica, she calls me up and she says, "Ed, are you guys shooting this weekend on the People Mover?" And I go, "Well, no, I would have sent you a request if I was doing that." I said, "Why?" Because never had they called me before. And she was like, "Well, we got this Hollywood crew in town, and they want to shoot on the People Mover, and we just don't want to make sure that you don't need it before we tell them yes or no." And I was like, wow. That is so cool. I mean, what other city in the planet would an indie filmmaker with no budget have a city film office that would work with them that way?
And what happened? I mean, Detroit was on its way to becoming, people were packing their bags up from prominent movie cities to come here and settle in and
we had people coming here from all over the world at that point. People who were creative people, who were artists and filmmakers, and people who were into rune spelunking. It was like I have a really good friend who's a photographer who specializes in doing nude photo shoots in abandoned buildings. And she was a fashion photographer in New York, and she moved here because she decided that Detroit was the best place in the world to be to do that kind of stuff.
It would have been so good for the city.
We had a funny thing. When we were pitching to Hollywood, we were talking to producers in Hollywood, and we had a producer who was going to pitch us to the Sci-Fi Channel. And he said to us, he says, you probably want to shoot this whole thing in Detroit, right? Because we were talking about reshooting it with name actors. And we said, yeah, because we were committed to the city. The whole thing was about creating a community here in the city for creative people. And he says, yeah, I can see that. It'd be pretty hard to recreate those sets on a soundstage. And what he was referring to was the Packard plant, all these buildings that we shot in, the Piquette plant. It was just, you can't do that, And at that time in Detroit, it was fairly easy to just walk into these places and shoot. I mean, at Packard plant at that time, it was supposedly owned by the city. They had security guards on it. We would just check with the security guards and go in and shoot. They knew us, and they didn't bother us. And there's not many places where you can have that experience, and consequently, it allowed us to make a pretty high quality product for almost nothing.
Yes. Yeah, it was pretty high quality product. It was extremely poetic and dystopian in a very, I don't know if you can be dystopian in an authentic way, but it seemed really, it was like really capturing almost the essence of what we've what we've done to get to that future. I mean, our actions and our decisions and our state of being planted, the seeds of that future. And I felt that, traces of today were really in that future, and especially, being in Detroit.
Well, and it really, back then, that was like almost 20 years ago. I mean, there were so many. Creative people were the only ones in Detroit, except for the people who lived here their whole lives and then never left. They were the only people moving in from outside back then. And, it was before gentrification. It was before the bankruptcy. And so you had all these artists and people. And what people loved was they could get cheap studio space. There were, if there were DJs or musicians, they could do rave parties in abandoned buildings easily, right?
Yeah.
And, it was just this kind of renaissance period where creative people were coming to town and doing all this stuff because it was just easy to do and cheap.
It would be amazing to that if someone did a documentary film on that and archive that whole process, because it's really finding, as Jean Genet says, finding the beauty in extremes and also finding beauty in what is abandoned. It's the artists found that beauty and honored it and gave thanks for that, that they could breathe in that space that was not manipulated and shiny and rigid. It was a space where through the broken cracks the truth could somehow maybe shine through, a little bit like how the virus affected us in 2020, and now we're going deeper into that. So,
and it was, there was a point where Detroit was broken, and people were moving. And it's funny. I did this project downtown where I was approached by one of the large property management firms, and I had a friend who worked for them, and they were doing a training session for their management people, and they gave them buildings to come up with something creative, like what can you do with this building creatively to make it cool, right?
God.
And she approached me, and they had this building on Woodward down by John R., and it was a space that had about 65 feet of window space right on Woodward. And she asked me if I thought it was possible to do an art gallery in the window.
Oh yes, and now you created the next community, didn't you?
Yeah,
You want to tell us about that?
So so I did that, and they were doing it because upstairs they had lofts they wanted to sell, and so the idea was we'll put art in the window, and then once a month we'll have an art opening party upstairs in the models, and people can come and they'll see the loft and they'll sell lofts. It was purely a commercial endeavor, but that's what they wanted to do. So we did that, and they sold all the lofts, and after a couple months they said, hey, we don't want to do this anymore. It's not working. And I said, what do you mean it's not working? They said, well, we sold all the lofts. We don't need to do it anymore. I said, so you mean it worked really well because you sold all the lofts, right? And they said, well, yeah, okay. And I said, okay, you sold all the lofts, but you haven't rented out the space downstairs where the art is. Can I keep putting art in that window? And they said, yeah, you can keep putting art in that window until we lease it. And so I had that window for almost 4 years. And every couple months I would change the art in it. And then I was approached by the Convention Bureau. They wanted to do a thing in the park, and they wanted to do, it was called Fourth Fridays. Yeah, Fourth Fridays, I think. And they had artist booths and things in the park, and then they were doing film on the stage, and they were doing bands sometimes, and they wanted me to handle the film and the art, and I said, well, let me just handle one thing. I'll find somebody else to do the film. But I said, can I use your name? Because they liked what I was doing in the window down the street. And so I said, can I use your name to talk to other landlords on the street and get more windows? And they said, yeah. And so they backed me up, and I walked up and down the from Grand Circus Park all the way down to the park, and we ended up with 9 buildings in a 6-block stretch. And we had art in those 9 buildings for almost a year, including when the Thanksgiving parade was happening, right? And hundreds of thousands of people saw that, and it was right after the Super Bowl. And during the Super Bowl, they let a lot of buildings in downtown get leased out for party locations.
Oh, okay.
So all these windows, like Cressy, and all these windows around where Hudson's was and all that, they all had like debris in them, beer can and football posters from those parties. Nobody ever cleaned up, and so it looked terrible.
Okay.
And we went in and cleaned them all up and put art in them. Right? So it just transformed the whole downtown. And we did that for 4 or 5 years, and nobody made any money on it.
Wow.
We didn't charge for it. The artists occasionally sold some art, and it was good publicity for them. But it wasn't about money, and it just changed the whole image of downtown because now there was art in all the windows. And at one point, we were averaging 30 or 40 artists in all those windows.
And did the project have a title?
We called it Edgewise.
Okay.
Yes. That was where Edgewise was born. Because the whole idea was, we were putting art. It was like a flower growing out of a crack in the sidewalk. That was the image. It was like putting art where there's abandonment,
And so you changed out the exhibition each month?
Not every month, but, and it's funny, as we did it, in the beginning we did it every month, but then it was like, oh, let's leave it for 3 months or 4 months. It got to be a lot of work to change it every month.
Yeah.
But it was great.
You could have taken it on tour.
We talked about that at one point. We we've actually had that idea with different artists in Detroit, like take them on tour, talk to a major gallery in every city in the country, and just take a Detroit tour. It's funny, I believe there was a gallery in LA that opened up that was called Detroit Gallery or something, and it was all art from Detroit in LA. Right?
Oh, wow.
It was somebody from Detroit who moved there and opened an art gallery, and they were only showing Detroit artists.
That's amazing.
And the other thing that happened that was really cool is back then there was a lot of graffiti and tags and things like that, but there weren't a lot of murals.
Okay.
And at some point what happened in that time period was we got more murals, and they were still being viewed as graffiti by the city, but they were art. And there was some point in there where they got legitimacy. And I think Eastern Market had a lot to do with it, because they started commissioning people to do murals, and they started bringing in big people. And you look at Detroit now, we've got murals everywhere, and it's great. Like, you can hardly go a block without seeing an amazing mural. And that wasn't the case way back then. I mean, it was like people were getting busted. I remember the DeQuinder Cut, before they re-landscaped it and made it a really cool 4-mile park. It was 4 feet of weeds with homeless people, and couches under all the bridges where the taggers would like drink beer while they were painting the underside of the bridges. Right? And I shot a film. I got the opportunity to walk it with the foreman who was cleaning it out.
Oh, wow.
He was in charge of the crew that was cleaning it out and getting it ready for the landscaping. And we walked the whole length of it when it was in the summer, and it was weeds higher than our heads. And they were, they were like little, it was like animal runs with like beat down spots where homeless people were camping in the weeds, but amazing art. Because all the serious taggers in Detroit were doing art under there, like uncommissioned, uncurated, just, throw a couch over the side and hang out for 4 days and paint art on the bottom of the bridges. And there's a lot of bridges over that cut from Eastern Market all the way down to the river, and every one of them had cool art on them.
Absolutely.
And some of that art was way cooler then than it is now, because it was constantly in flux. It'd be changed all the time, because a new artist would come in and redo this end, and it was always being repainted. That was cool. So it was, there's been this transition of more and more art. And I mean, now we have all these events like the Electricity in September, Detroit, the Month of Design, and it's all these events have contributed to this general atmosphere of art being cool. And appreciated by everybody, not just by the art community.
You're watching WJZZ Cool TV, the coolest station in the world. This is Mediterranean Fire, streaming on Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, and other top media platforms. Like, follow, comment, and subscribe.
So let's talk about Lebanon and Syria.
Okay.
They have murals?
Let me see, do they have murals? Wait, they have amazing artists over there. I remember, I had gone there right as the war had finished, and at that point, people were saying that it was too early. It was like there was no art in a way during war. There was no reason for art, so there was no art. But of course there were artists, so those who were living for art were, doing the art in the way that they could. Of course, practicing their piano, maybe doing a little concert here and there. And then the painters, the paintings also, they were a little bit also as though the war and everything that happened was just incomprehensible. Nobody really knew the cause of it. Nobody really knew who was making the war. Just like we're sitting here and we, things are happening to people in the world and to the planet, and we just can't really put our hands on it. We really don't know, what we should do, because we really don't know how we can stop what's happening. But what happened was, 10 years later, suddenly there was like an art renaissance. It was pretty strong after the war. Theater after the war is the strongest art form, I think, because I was influenced by Bertolt Brecht, who went to Berlin after the war.
Right.
And so when I went to Lebanon, I was very conscious of Bertolt Brecht, and knowing that after a war, theater is a very important art form. It congregates people in the theater. There are human beings on the stage and human beings in the public, and something important could happen there, especially in those kind of places where the art is not going to be, I don't know, I can't think of another word, but except for dreamy right now. It'll have to be almost like a propaganda, but it's unconscious that it's a propaganda, because they're about to lose their country, so everything becomes political in the everyday life, whether they want it or not. So even the art is talking about what the people are going through, so the theater was very strong, and it took time for the visual arts to sort of start incorporating this, what they had lived, and they did. Like 10 years later, like, I guess the memory of it was lighter than the actuality of it, and with the lightness and the weightlessness of the memory, they were able then to start creating some art forms and a language that was really recognizable, that was related to this humanistic, I don't want to call it a cry, expression of what was taking place in the war. But the funny thing is that, then the Syrian war started in the country next to Lebanon, and it started like 2 decades after. But what happened was the Syrians were so, they're very close to Lebanon, and they had been, of course, seeing the artwork that was coming from Lebanon. So when their war started, they embarked on the paintings right away. They had a pathway already. They understood, the key, and they understood the importance of the artwork, and it was their way of resisting the war, and it was a way of making their dreams come true. I've said it before. It's like the concept of my work a little bit, that the only way to destroy a person is by destroying their dream, and a person will do anything he can to realize his dream, even if there's war, because everybody.
So the art really became cathartic for them, but it was also political. It was a way of communicating.
Yeah, it was about people who didn't want to be political and who were not political, but the politics are coding the everyday life so much that you can't not talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Everything's political in a war environment. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
How for the people who aren't really familiar with that area, and like here in America, we're like not really good about geography of any other place in the world. I mean, most of us don't even know where things in the United States are.
Yeah.
What Lebanon and Syria are right next to each other, but what are we in distance? Those are small countries, right?
They're smaller countries, and the thing is, they're really one country that was divided by a Western country. So, and what happened was, the little bit that's called Lebanon was then colonized by France and then by Britain, and Syria was not and refused to be colonized. So Syria then, with time, that's why it engendered a dictatorship, because it was also, they were trying to make sure that everyone was always speaking Arabic, that everything was written in Arabic, that you're not, gonna get colonized by the French or the British. And then Lebanon, on the other hand, was Now they had an education system that one branch was French, another branch was English, and then the popular one was Arabic, and then it was the golden age, actually, from around my grandmother's time, which would be like around the 1920s, all the way up through till the Civil War started, which was like in the early 70s. So it was a period where, like, you hear the older generation talking, you know, and you see their photos. They have so much light in their eyes, and everybody is looking so blissful and so, you know, really, and, you know, I don't know what it is. Maybe I have no idea what it is, but I did think of it when I went to Lebanon again at the time when the Syrians were fleeing their country in order to try to stay alive, you know, so many families. And Lebanon, because of what they lived, was one of the only country, if you remember that moment, like the doors were being shut on them in Germany. There's too many refugees here and all in Europe, and Lebanon couldn't do it because they could really identify, they knew what the Syrians were going through because they lived it. And so they had, I can't remember the number, but I think they're like 1 million, maybe, I can't remember, but it's an immense amount of refugees, at least 100,000, but it could be like triple or quadruple that I'm saying right now. I just can't remember the numbers. It was open border policy, so they have this connection with each other, and if anything happened in Lebanon, Syria would have an open border policy. The entire population of Lebanon would be allowed to come to Syria, and vice versa. So then when that happened, what you would see in Lebanon was that on the streets there were all these quasi-homeless people, which are called refugees, all the families of lower middle class and middle class. Nobody has work now. Everyone's a refugee. Lawyers are refugees. Doctors are refugees. Teachers are refugees. Everybody's a refugee. And they're living in tents, in refugee tents that are set up like you could imagine them set up in the parking lots in downtown and on the street edges, on the river edges. And but the streets of Lebanon were filled with Syrian people. There were more Syrian people on the actual streets of Lebanon, and the Lebanese people would be more like sitting in their buildings, in their offices, in their homes, in their shops, doing things. And then the streets were filled with Syrian people, and then I understood what, you know, because now it was like suddenly Lebanon felt like it was decolonized too. Like suddenly there wasn't that French element, there wasn't that British, you know, element of that open-mindedness, spontaneous, laughing, playing people on the street, kind of like ironic intelligence. You know, it was like guttural. It was an ancient culture. It was, you know, it was a hot energy. You know, it was just, you know, very, very, very different. So, I mean, so Lebanon went through that, and then you can imagine now. I mean, I'm like free flowing with the conversation, but I just flashed on the explosion that happened in Lebanon, you know,
right,
recently. So all those Syrians are there on the street while, you know, and nobody knew it was going to happen. It was like a place, a refugee, you know, place suddenly, and you know, and then on top of it, that explosion, and yeah, it's but the people are extremely resilient, and they can unite very quickly, and very smart, and I mean, the art and the culture and the science and the movements that are coming from there. I mean, the whole system of economy that we use in the planet was born from there, as well as all the religions, most of the religions except for the Far Eastern ones, sprung from there as well. It's a place of some very, very high energy, and you can I always think about what I feel sometimes, so I think it can be felt when you go there that it has a different energy, and I think that we have to. I don't think will do it, but these things should be taken into consideration when we're looking at other countries and we're talking about our democracy and socialism and all these things, because there are different energies in different geographical locations, and they, as Jean Genet says, who I mentioned a couple times today, says every place in the world is also a place within you, and when you travel somewhere in the world, you're traveling to another place within yourself. I mean, this is very personal. This is, when I'm in Berlin, I feel like the center is here, and yeah, I mean, it shifts when
Like
in
different
different
areas have
places.
different
Yeah,
vibrations.
and then you have a different train of thought. Also, you change
Right.
countries, and suddenly there are other thoughts coming up. There's another line of thinking, and I've seen it so many times that people that travel a lot and they're like doing projects, like they'll think of like planning things. Okay, in 4 days I'm going, to this country, and I want to be prepared when I get there. So I want this and this and this, and we're going to do this and that. And then they get to the other country, but their train of thought changes completely, and everyone prepared for this and that, but it didn't,
Right.
happen.
I think
Yeah.
that's really true. I know for myself, I mean, I've lived in 4 or 5 different cities, and they all have a totally different energy.
Mhm.
I mean, when I go to Los Angeles, it's like the minute I get off the plane, it's like there's a whole different energy
Yeah.
here. And New York's the same way. I mean,
Mhm.
you get in Manhattan, and it's just like,
Mhm.
what? No place else is like this.
Mhm.
That's good.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you more about those places because they're they're like the identity of our country somehow. And I mean, I don't know if it's my country. I've been out of it for 30 years, but California and New York, and young people, when they all maybe want to go to California or New York, and now of course there's other places, Georgia and
Seattle.
where else? Seattle.
Yeah.
So what can you tell us about? I don't know. You lived in Hollywood, and what don't we know about it? What?
Well, I think it's funny. I lived in California for 20 years, and I went there, when I was fairly young, and I lived in San Francisco for a while, and then I went to Los Angeles, and then I got out of the city, and I went to Lake Tahoe, and I lived in the mountains for 3-4 years, and then I moved down to Sacramento, and it was like all these different environments, and California is unique that it has all these different environments. It's got mountains, it's got ocean, it's got rivers.
Like Lebanon, yeah.
Yeah, and it's
the
so
same
you
climate.
can, you've got all these different ecosystems and energies, and the same is true in terms of like who lives there. I mean, California is a state of diversity. It's like, I remember at one point, I think it was when I left actually, I remember seeing some numbers that, it was like California was 70% Hispanic and 15% Asian, and then black and white was what was left. And that's not true of, I mean, maybe some of the southern states like Texas and Arizona.
Is that true, what you just said about California?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's true
Oh my
today, but
God.
those were the numbers I remember from when I came back here, which was in '98. So you think about that, and if you're in, I mean, you look at Los Angeles. I mean, Los Angeles is huge.
I'd like to
And
give
it's-
the station ID as soon. Yes, go on talking about the hugeness.
Okay.
Yes.
So Los Angeles is so big that, like you can fly from Phoenix and you take off and you climb up and you go over a mountain range, and then you're on the other side of that mountain range, and the pilot says, we're on our final approach to LAX, and you're still an hour away, right? But when you look down, you're in Metro LA. It's like,
Oh, yes. Yes.
It's like, it takes you like 3-4 hours to drive from one side of Los Angeles to the other.
Mm-hmm.
And, so if people don't realize that, and in its neighborhoods, it's like, here's a Mexican neighborhood, here's a Thai neighborhood, here's a Cambodian neighborhood, here's a Korean neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
And you have these vast neighborhoods where frequently, depending which it is, you might not hear English all day in that neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And most cities have like a Chinatown or a Mexico town or a Greek town, like we do,
Mm-hmm.
but you don't like go in and lose track of English.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, I used to work with a lot of Vietnamese,
Mm-hmm.
and I'd go out with them to have lunch in LA, and I'd be the whole day I wouldn't hear anybody speaking English unless they were talking to me.
Mm-hmm.
And
You're watching WJZZ Cool TV, the coolest station in the world, on Mediterranean Fire, streaming live on Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter, and other top social media platforms. Like us, follow us, subscribe, and share. WJZZ is the coolest station in the world.
I always used to tell people when I lived in California people from outside California that, it isn't just a state, it's a state of mind.
Mm-hmm.
Like, people in California have a whole different mentality about everything.
But don't you think that like 1/4 of that, 1/4 of that is due to the climate itself?
Could be. And it's a Mediterranean climate.
Because it's very open, like Mediterranean. If you think of Greece.
And it's artificial for a lot of, as far as being human friendly. It's like Los Angeles. I don't even know how many million people there are in Los Angeles, but if you turn the water off, it'd be a desert
Mm-hmm.
in about a week.
Mm-hmm.
Because it is a desert. There's no natural water sources there except snow melt.
Okay.
And that's their problem right now. They've had less snow and all the reservoirs are emptying, and so they're having a drought. But it's all dependent on snow because, they don't get that much rain. And the rain they do get runs right into the rivers and out to sea. So
speaking of drought, I'm not trying to make a connection between the two at all, but we were talking about like the war zones and Syria, though it was politics. A lot of it was politics, but the truth is that there was also a drought there during about 2 years before the war started, and when people's crops die and there's no more food and they can't get what they need for their families. The whole movement called the Arab Spring started when a man in Tunisia went into the public square and he set himself on fire, and everybody in the country went out on the street. Every single person in the country went out on the street because enough was enough, and finally they did it. They went out and then they were able to overthrow their government. And then what happened was Egypt was watching them, and then Egypt followed directly, and everybody went out on the street and they overthrew their government. And then Italy, that's been sitting there trying to get rid of their leader for a long time, did the same thing. So we're going to be wrapping up this session of Mediterranean Fire. We hope that you enjoyed it, and I'm so glad that we have Ed Gardner with us. It is an honor and a great pleasure, and we'll just keep you informed about the events that we'll be organizing, and thank you so much.
Join us next week.
Join us next week, yes. And I think, I think we still have a couple minutes in any case, so let me see. So what do you think, what's the difference now between Detroit now and the Detroit of the time of the art exhibitions and all that?
Well, it's more civilized now.
It's more civilized.
I'm not sure it's better, but it's more civilized.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
there's more people. There's a lot of newer stuff.
Mm-hmm. And technology has taken over forever.
Sure, and we have streetlights, and we have buses, and you know, we
that's
have all these
different.
new things
I
now that we
know
didn't
it's
have
different.
before.
Okay.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for a long time there were vast stretches of Detroit that didn't have streetlights,
Mm-hmm.
which is scary for people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yes.
You know, and you know, there's been a lot of progress in demoing abandoned houses, and you know, there's a lot more to do, but
Mm-hmm.
slowly that's happening. And
Mm-hmm. And how do you think it would be to go into a neighborhood that's not central, and maybe work with a group of people on a kind of a film where they could apply different healing techniques. That because I was
different healing techniques.
yeah,
for-
like there are different healing techniques. Some of them are energy work. Others are like there's the tapping technique.
right, I know that.
There's somatic healing, and I would love to do that. I would love to just go and get a group of people and have them like undergo
Like a mobile-
an art therapy
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
thing. I think that would be the thing of the future. Yeah.
I like the idea of having community filmmakers.
Ah.
You know, like especially with younger people, like get the high school kids and have them be responsible for creating like local networks of, you know, like local newspapers, except they're not newspapers, they're websites with
Uh-huh.
videos, you know.
Mhm.
But where it brings the community together and